Hello, everyone. My name is Vivian Moreno. I'm the coordinator of the Pacific Alliance Study Program. This event is part of the international month when our country is United States. So today we'll be talking about the migration politics, and Professor Blimey will be the moderator of this conference.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for this brief introduction. I am Vladimir Rubinsky. I'm professor at the Department of Political Studies, and I'm also director of Pacific Alliance Studies program here at Estados University. And it's a great pleasure for me to give a very warm welcome to ISESI and to Colombia, to a colleague of mine, Professor Andrei Korovkov, who is visiting us from Nashville, Tennessee. And let me, first of all, briefly introduce Professor Korovkov. He's professor of political science and international relations at the Middle Tennessee State University. And in the recent past, he also served as a director of master's programs in international affairs. Andrei has earned 2 doctoral degrees, one in the economics from the Institute of International Economic and Political Studies, and another in political science from the University of Alabama. He has previously worked as research fellow at the Institute of International Economics and Political Studies and taught various undergraduate and graduate courses at the University of Alabama before joining the Middle Tennessee State University. Andrei authored several monographs and numerous articles and book chapters published in the United States and other countries. His academic interests include the issues of post-communist transition, political populism, state and nation building, nationalism, globalization and regionalism, geopolitics, ethnic conflicts, and last but not least, what actually we will be talking today is the issues of international migration. He has previously served as the U.S. co-chair of the Working Group on Migration and president of the Post-Communist States and International Relations section of the International Studies Association and currently serve as the section vice president and program chair. Andrei, in the United States. Pardon? Are you American?
Yeah, currently.
And I'm Colombian, but my last name doesn't sound very Colombian.
Currently, yes. Yeah, you know, the question that you ask is periodically asked in the US as well, because I speak somewhere in the north and they say, well, your accent is not exactly Southern, because, well, there are huge differences in the US among regions, and Nashville is in the South. Yet the question that you asked is highly relevant because we'll be talking about migration, various kinds of migration, including the so-called brain drain, so the elite intellectual migration. And both Professor Rubinsky and I are among those brains that have drained pretty long ago. Some of you might in the future belong to the same category because, interestingly, Colombians have the highest share of people with a bachelor's degree or higher among Latin American migrants to the US, more than 32%. So, for example, among Mexicans coming to the US, just 11% have bachelors, and the lowest figure is for people from El Salvador, it's less than 8%. So we'll be talking about it specifically, and I will start by a very cynical but kind of succinct statement that was made about already 15 years ago by the former French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, who, by the way, himself was a descendant of people from Hungary, migrants from Hungary to France. He said, you know what, migration is a kind of controversial topic. And there are 2 types of migrants in the modern world, or to be exact, the migration flows in the modern world, the desired one and the suffered one. And by saying it, he meant that there are 2 absolutely different migration flows taking place in the world right now, and they have very different treatment from the receiving governments. There is a high degree of competition for the elite migrants that belong to 4 major categories. And these categories are educational migrants, students. We'll look later at a table illustrating this trend. There are more than 6 million educational migrants right now in the world. The other 3 categories are academic personnel, so either professors or researchers, highly qualified migrants that include people who can be managers and technicians and computer scientists, but also stars of the arts, cultural figures, and leading athletes. And finally, the absolutely new category of elite migrants, the possessors of the so-called golden visas, or investment migrants, people who simply buy citizenship or permanent status in particular countries. And there are countries that are eagerly and happily selling even their passports in exchange for large-scale investments. Say in the case of the US, you can invest $1 million or more, open up to 10 workplaces anywhere in the US and ask for a green card. Or you can invest in a really dump area that is in economic decline, say in Flint, Michigan. And then it's enough to invest 300,000 and open 3 workplaces. So there is an increasing competition worldwide for these types of migrants. And at the same time, there is migration that Sarkozy has characterized as the suffered one. States either have to admit such migrants due to internal constitutional requirements or international treaties that they have signed. For example, the refugees. There are about 25 million refugees right now in the world, close to 5 million people asking for asylum, so for protection in other countries. States frequently have to admit them even if they don't want to do that. There are members of families of state citizens, and the different states have different attitude towards them, but there are practically always some loopholes for these people. This is the largest category of migrants coming, for example, to the United States. And then there are low qualified migrants and, the undocumented migrants. Here, there's some discrepancy. Well, you hear all the time from journalists, from politicians about the illegal migrants, but the term illegal presumes that people not only cross the border illegally, they also intend to commit specific crimes. Because of that, migration specialists are trying to avoid this term. Biden also has banned state officials to use it, and they talk about the irregular, undocumented, informal migration, but not the illegal migration. So if we look at the US, the majority of people who are now in an undocumented status, they have to come to the US absolutely legally. They had a visa, they came with a particular purpose, for example, tourism, visiting somebody, educational migration, and then they decided to stay, so they overstayed their visa, and they became, after that, the irregular migrants. Those who cross the border illegally represent them a minority within the group of undocumented migrants in reality. But it's a very hot, useful topic for the politicians, so they practically always use the term illegal migration. So what about the numbers? Can we look at the first slide? You would see that the number of migrants worldwide has exceeded 280 million. It's about 3.6% of the world population. It's a significant figure, and you can see it keeps growing. But it also tells us an interesting story. First of all, the number was expected right now to be about 2 million higher than it is. The reason it is less than the one expected is COVID, the COVID pandemic. But still, the number, well, keeps growing, and it is pretty high. So 3.6% of the world population. This figure by itself reminds us of two interesting things. If we look at the second slide, you would see that migrants are leaving all regions of the world and are coming to all regions of the world. And about 2/3 of migrants right now go to the highly developed countries of the global north. But about 1/3 of migrants are within the global south. And for example, among Venezuelans, 72% of those who left Venezuela are located in neighboring countries, including Colombia. So migration, while it creates pressure on all regions of the world, it is increasingly becoming an issue for the countries in the global south. Now, is migration a blessing, or is it really a problem for the receiving countries? We have to keep here in mind two processes that take place. First, the demographic process, and second, the economic process related to globalization. At present, 90 countries in the world, so close to a half, are encountering the demographic decline. The number of deaths exceeds that of live births. And that means that while the population of the world keeps growing, the population of a huge number of countries is declining. And what is interesting, joining this group in within the 10-year period will be China. So the country that was the leader of the population growth, the country with the largest population. First, next year it will lose its first place. India will become the highest, country with the largest population. And China will get to the second place, and soon after that, its population will start to decline. So what can you do? So the population growth is a product of three factors. First, population birth rates, second, population death rates, and immigration. And in order for population to grow through the internal factors, an average woman has to have 2.15 children during her lifespan. Why? Because half of them will be girls, some girls will die before childbearing age, some will not have children. So you have to have at least two 1.5 children in order for the population to grow. Right now, in the highly developed countries, this ratio is between 1.2 and 1.4. So there are not enough kids being born. And then a country has three options. First option, you have to encourage women and, well, people in general to have more children through some measures of the natality policy. Some countries have such measures, some countries do not. For example, in the US, there's practically no natality policy. And even if you undertake such policies, they will give some result within a pretty long period of time. Second, you have extend life expectancy by introducing also social programs, by developing your national health care service and so on. But this approach has its caveats because, yes, your population might stabilize or even grow, but the share of old people in the population will keep growing as well. and say we already have close to 8 billion people on this planet, and of them more than 1 billion are older than 65 years old, and more than 200 million older than 80 years. And in such countries as Germany, Italy, Japan, the share of 65-year-olds and older is in excess of 25%. So this policy would not work always. Then there is a third approach. You can increase immigration. But if you increase immigration, you might encounter 4 other blocks of problems. First, there might show up xenophobia, fear of the loss of ethnic homogeneity or racial or religious or cultural or linguistic, any kind. Second, socioeconomic fear that migrants would come in, increase competition on the labor market, raise, well, in general, expenditures of the social sphere, and lower salaries for everybody because of the increasing competition. Personal security issues, well, simply put, crime rates. And finally, state security issues, proliferation of terrorism, various separatist movements, and so on. And we see that politicians are very eagerly and very actively playing all these cards. There were 4 elections that took place in Europe this year: Sweden, Italy, Hungary. In all 3 of those, nationalists and populists not simply won, they were able to form cabinets. In the 4th election in France, the extreme right, well, the former National Front, has drastically strengthened its position. And there were 2 major reasons for that. Well, the anti-EU feelings, the demands to increase state sovereignty, but second, they all were playing some kind of anti-immigrant card. So this is a touchy issue. Now, well, you have tried one option. Let's increase immigration. And for some reason, the population did not support it. The nationalists came to power. What are your other options? One option is what the West was doing for the last 40 years, outsourcing, moving industries that you really don't like in your territory, that are labor intensive, that are dirty, the so-called 3Ds, dangerous, demeaning, and dangerous, demeaning, dirty. And surprise, 40 years later, the leading countries found out that they are totally dependent on imports from countries like China. So it's not always popular. You can opt for the third, well, potential option. What is it? Well, you can say, okay, I am okay even with the declining economic growth. I just want to protect my population homogeneity, and I don't want to lose my economic potential. We'll concentrate on quality, for example, of production. To some extent, Germans did it, Swiss, but also Japan. The Japanese did not want to lose their identity, so they made it very hard to migrate to Japan, and at the same time, we're trying to retain their economy. And the result was, ironically, even more disastrous than in countries that tried other 2 approaches. What happened? Well, first they faced the declining rates of economic growth, and then the share of the old people started to very quickly increase. And the Japanese are record holders in first the number of people older than 65, the number of people older than 80, and the number of people older than 100 now. And what does it happen? What happens in such situation in a country? And I will have to lower it a little bit now. But the normal demographic pyramid would look like a real pyramid. you will have a small number of people in the old ages, a significant number of people in the working ages that are counted by demographers between 15 and 64. So they are productive in both senses. They can work and they can, for the most part, produce new children. And the largest number would be of children up to 15 years old that you have to spend the money on. Well, it's a good investment because later they would work and they will produce children. And right now, in countries like Japan, we see a reverse pyramid. So there's an increasing number of people in young ages, a smaller number of people, relatively smaller number in productive ages, and a very small number of children. And it means two very unpleasant things. It means that at some point there would not be enough people working, generating taxes to support people in the old age. And increasingly, it's an issue of simply labor. There wouldn't be enough people to take care of those people in the older ages, including people who would work in medical professions, in nursing, and so on. And what Japan is doing, and it's ironic, in the last 5 years, they have adopted a number of laws that allow for an easy migration to the US, to Japan, I'm sorry, of people belonging to healthcare professions and nursing professions. And they can get now green cards and even an easy pass to citizenship. In Japan, that had a very negative attitude to immigration and, quite frankly, to minorities. More than that, the Japanese right now are encouraged to engage in the search for the so-called internet brides. So bringing in women of productive ages as wives from mostly from the surrounding regions, Korea and some others. But the biggest surprise of recent years is a total man-made disaster that took place in China. China for 40 years had a one family, one child policy. You were not allowed to have more than one child. Peasants were not allowed to have more than 2 children. And there were very strict, brutal measures, forced abortions, the denial of any social support for people who dared to have more than one child. For example, they had to pay then for children's schooling, for healthcare services, and so on. And the result is the same what it is in Japan, a reverse pyramid that is further worsened by the tremendous scale of infanticide. So families were checking the gender of the fetuses and aborting girls. And there was a huge number of female infanticide as well. So newly born were killed. And in addition to the general pyramid, this pyramid is skewed male-wise. So there are many more men than women in the younger generations. And the Chinese right now are first are encouraged also to bring waves from abroad. For example, there is a huge flow of North Korean women who enter China illegally, leave North Korea illegally, and find themselves in a position very frequently of wife slaves. And it is expected that China, a country that has one of 3 largest diasporas abroad, that has had huge outmigration, will soon become one of the largest importers of immigrant labor and immigrant receiving country in general. And it's really a man-made disaster, not the result of any specific demographic processes, but the result of a targeted government policy. So that's an interesting side to it. When we talk about immigration, there are always 2 sides to it. First, the interest of a state. So migration as a macroeconomic process. And second, the human side of migration. Well, the position of migrants in this world migrant chain. And as a rule, this second aspect of immigration is pretty much ignored. When there are, well, massive refugee flows, the attention of the public turns towards this issue. Like, for example, the current refugee flow from Ukraine to many countries. But for the most part, migration is considered only from the point of view of sending state interest or receiving state interest. And here we have to say that there are different types of migration. The most important divide here is between the international migration, when people cross the international borders, and the internal domestic migration. The second is much larger in size, but we hear about it much less. Many of you probably are the internal migrants. If you moved from your city to Cali, for example, to study, you are already a migrant and you're already an educational migrant. China alone has more than 200 million internal migrants. And most of these migrants technically would be the undocumented ones, because you need a permission to move in China. Most migrants do not do it, losing their access to social benefits in a province they come to. So their fate is not frequently a very good one, but it's not visible, especially to the outside world. Second, migration can be voluntary or involuntary, the so-called forced one migration. And of course, within forced migration, the most important place belongs to refugees and the so-called IDPs, the internally displaced persons. The internally displaced persons are people who were forced by circumstances to move within the territory of their state. There are more IDPs right now in Ukraine than the external migrants, but usually the international community does not hear about them much. There are more than 50 million IDPs in the world right now. There are 25 million of refugees, people who were forced to leave their country of citizenship due to the threat or the perceived threat to their lives, to their security, based on their race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, social standing, or political views. There are about 5 million asylum seekers, people who came to a different country, asked for protection, but have not received a status yet. And there are other types of forced migrants. Their overall number is about 100 million out of the general number, remember, of 280 million. Their status is regulated by the UN Refugee Convention of 1948. Many countries have signed and ratified it. The US, for example, has signed it but did not ratify it since 1948. The US refugee policy is regulated by the 1980 Refugee Act. And according to this act, the president has a right to define a quota for refugee reception for any year and provide funds for these refugees. And there were tremendous fluctuations in the US refugee policies. For example, when Trump came to power, he had a very negative attitude towards migration in general and towards the refugees. And in the first year of his presidency, the US received 85 million refugees. In the last year of Trump presidency, the US had a quota of 18,000, but received just 11,800 refugees. There was a second factor, of course, it was the pandemic, but in general, the policy was, let's cut the number of refugees. Biden came in and Biden had to maneuver and continues to maneuver among different factions of the Democratic Party, from the extreme left to the moderates. and their positions are practically incompatible. And thus he promised in the first year of his presidency to receive 62,500,000 refugees. The real figure was about 20,000. That's all he could receive. So 62,500 quota and 20,000 were accepted. Next year, well, for this year, the quota is 125,000. And he promised to bring in 100,000 Ukrainians during these 2 years. None of those quotas would be fulfilled, mostly for political reasons. Okay, now let's move to the next issue. Migrants move between countries. In general, there are 3 types of countries in the world in regard to migration. First type, the scenic countries, countries of emigration, countries that people leave because of particular factors. Second, countries of immigration, the receiving countries, the host countries for migrants. And third, the countries of transit. People come to those countries, they don't want to stay there in reality. They move through them and try to get to some other region. So say if we look at the US, it is clearly a host country for migrants. Most people come to the US to stay there. Not many countries sneak to the US because they say, we want to get to El Salvador. Well, second, countries that are sending countries. El Salvador would be a classical sending country. Transit countries, Turkey, Russia, Mexico. And you can see that many countries combine different roles. Say Mexico sends millions to the US, receives people from Central America and many Latin American countries. And many people use its territory to move through in order to get to the US. So countries can combine different functions. Migration is a very important economic factor of life. So migration on the one hand lowers the pressure on the economies and social systems of states that have excess population. On the other hand, migration offers cheap labor to countries that lack adequate labor population. More than that, while migration can offer demographic resources to particular countries. But simultaneously, migration can create pressure on social welfare systems and labor markets in the receiving countries. Migration is one of the major sources of development to many countries that are sending migrants abroad. And here you can see the figures. So our first slide, if I could read, which one is that? Shows the top 10 remittance recipients. So countries that have sent migrants abroad and are receiving their monetary transfers. You can see India, China, the Philippines, but also surprisingly Germany and a number of other countries receive huge amounts of money. I'll return to it later. If you look at the second slide, here the major sending countries, the US, with the bulk of this money going first of all to Mexico, but also to such countries as India. And Saudi Arabia, Germany, Switzerland, France, Russia, are countries that send more than the others. For some countries, it's a huge financial resource. But what's interesting, India is ranked first among countries that receive remittances from their migrants living abroad. but the share of remittances in India's GDP is just 3%. For countries like Tonga, South Sudan, Lebanon, Kyrgyzstan, the share of remittances in their GDP is about 30% or higher. So it's more than the whole international assistance these countries get and all the direct investment in their economies. They would not be able to survive without the migrants' remittances and without migrants living and thus lowering pressure on their labor markets. So that's important. Very frequently, say in the US, you can hear from the right that, well, it's a huge problem for us that migrants from Mexico, from Central America come, and besides competing on the labor market, they take our dollars and send them abroad. In reality, this is a major factor in stabilizing the economies of those countries. And if not for that, the US would have had to invest something there in order to avoid simply social explosions. Now, we say there are host countries of migration. There are, and before I move forward, let's look at a couple of next slides. So the top countries of international, educational system. You can see the US leads, but the US has 16% of 6 million international students, a huge share. But look, in the second place is Australia, a country with a population that is more than 10 times smaller than that of the US. So Australia was deliberately developing its international education system oriented towards the Pacific Rim and the Indian Ocean basin. So they make tremendous money on that. Plus, it's a mechanism of their soft power. The UK, similar. Germany, first of all, oriented towards the Europeans. And surprisingly, in the fifth place is Russia, that also was quite deliberately developing its international education system. We move further on, and again, surprise, the United Arab Emirates, a country that also was deliberately developing its new specialization, first of all, as the major service and financial hub, but also as an educational structure. And it's interesting. You can also see that China, while sending a tremendous number of students abroad, and to be exact, China, throughout the last 40 years, has sent abroad 2.6 million students to study primarily in the West. But China is also trying to become a major educational hub for, first of all, the surrounding region in East and South Asia. So, okay, all this is important. But now let's think in general. We say home countries of migrants, host countries of migrants. Let's talk a little bit about the host countries of migrants. There are 4 types of such states that are the most interesting. First type, the countries of traditional immigration. These are primarily the former British colonies, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and also belonging to this group is Israel. They are the countries of immigrants. They have been settled by migrants with the local population, except for South Africa being practically completely exterminated in the process. These countries have very different culture, attitude towards migrants. They, as a rule, have well-developed systems of accommodating migrants. And they were the pioneers in defining, nation in civic terms. So mostly through identity and not, say, genetic belonging. But there are paradoxes there. Well, Israel has very well-developed system of accommodating migrants, but defines migration still mostly in ethno-religious terms. The United States pursues a market-based system of immigration. So basically you come, you are welcome, but you have to deal with your problems on your own. Canada and Australia have been the pioneers of the so-called point system. More than 60% of migrants coming to Canada come on the basis of this system. So you can hear a lot of nice things from Canadians that, well, they pursue humanitarian policies, but more than 60% come on the basis of their ability. So you can apply for immigration to Canada without many obstacles, but you have to fulfill particular conditions. If you are 35 or younger, if you are married, if you are fluent in local languages, if you have specific professions and you have academic degrees, it's very easy for you to get a permit to get in. But if you don't, you are in pretty much trouble. Second group of countries is very interesting. These are the former empires. These empires were of three major types. First, territorially contiguous empires such as Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Turkey. Before that, the Arab Empire, Chinese Empire, and so on. They were territorially contiguous. They are the hardest to get separated, as we can see now, for example, in the post-Soviet space. Second, the huge territorial but divided empires, such as Spanish Empire, Colombia was part of it, or Portugal, or the United Kingdom, or France. They had a core and ethnically and religiously different other parts. And finally, the so-called Maritime Empires. Again, Portugal and the Netherlands would fall into this category. And such empires, when they fell apart, faced two very different waves of migration. First wave, people belonging to the so-called master race. So Spaniards, Portuguese, Brits, and so on were living after independence and going to the homeland. And this was mostly politically motivated migration. And then they came the second type of migration, people from the former colonial parts, from the periphery, from the newly independent states, started to go to the metropole. So like to Spain, to Portugal, to the UK, forming diasporas there. This is the most probably visible type of migration movements. And third type, countries that went in recent time, pretty long, yeah, through the tremendous economic explosion. The United Arab Emirates, Singapore, other countries in the Gulf. They grow very quickly, but they don't have labor, especially qualified labor. And they start bringing huge numbers of migrants to feed their economies. And there emerged a very interesting time bomb. Say in United Arab Emirates, the share of migrants is in the population is 88%. In Qatar, 77%. And in countries, say to the US, these people cannot change their status. They come, they are separated from the locals. They have no rights to change their legal position. And very frequently they are different, either ethnically or religiously or culturally from the locals. And they become increasingly angry, and we'll see how it would go. There was already one situation when it came very close to the internal crisis. It was in Bahrain. But then the Saudis sent their troops with the US politely looking the other way, and the essentially civil war was prevented, at least for a little while. And finally, countries that have changed their position very sharply in the world migration chain. Venezuela is an interesting example. So first it was a receiving country, and then it became a major sending country. China, we have mentioned China, and interestingly, Russia, that was a closed country that was also a core of the empire in which Russians were going to the ethnic regions. And now it became the center of one of 4 largest immigration hubs in the world. So there are 4 major migration systems in the world right now: North American, around the US, European, around the EU, and first of all, Germany, Eurasian, around Russia, and the 4th one is the Gulf system, around Saudi Arabia and other states of the Gulf. So they bring in huge numbers of migrants, and they consume most of the migrant flow taking place in the world. But there would be others. And well, Vladimir already sent me a signal that I've been talking too much, so I probably stop here. Just after showing you the last slide, it's interesting. This is the situation in the US right now. We have the 2nd largest share of migrants in the US population at present, 13.5%. Higher it was only about 130 years ago when it reached 14.8%. And at that time, it has led to the introduction of highly discriminatory migration policy. Migration was limited and it decreased about 12-fold. And well, the system of discriminatory quotas was created, under which Africa, South and East Asia were totally excluded. People from those regions could not come to the US. And we are reaching the same share, and we see how migration is becoming a very hot and politically divisive topic in the United States society. Well, an interesting place here belongs to people from Latin America, because their number has exceeded 60 million, 62.5 million right now. And it is expected that the share of Hispanics in the US population would reach 25% by the year 2050. In the year 2045, whites will lose their majority in the US population. They will remain a plurality, but they will lose their absolute majority. And you can see how these trends influence the US policy. Trump has won to a very large extent, thanks to the fact that he started to play immigration, but under the criticism of immigration, he was addressing the white population in general, hinting at that he would protect its interest in a situation when its share in the population in general is consistently declining. Right now, the share of whites in the US population is 59.7%. Again, by 2045, within just 1 generation, they would lose their majority in the US population, and it has a tremendous impact on the internal US politics, and not in the best way possible. And on this optimistic note, well, I should probably wrap it up. Thank you.
No, we will have Q&A. Thank you very much, Andrei, for, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for this general, I would say, observation of the tendencies related to the international migration. It's extremely interesting. I think for us here in Colombia, of course, we unfortunately, we are very much familiar with the IDP phenomenon that you mentioned, internally displaced people. Colombia, I think, was because we managed to improve this scenario, but was one of the major countries around the world comparing to the proportion of the population internally displaced because of the internal armed conflict. We had millions of people here that were forced to move from unsecure areas to the cities, and we have all the kind of related problems. But it's important also for our students to know that it is not a particular phenomenon of Colombia. We did suffer, and those people do suffer because of the internal armed conflict, but we have millions of people internally displaced in other parts of the world. So it's also useful to learn about those experiences and to understand better how to deal with them. Yes, we will have now Q&A session, and you're welcome to ask questions. You may ask in Spanish, and then I will do my best to translate your questions to English. But before that, I would like to ask one, I think, important question for us here in Colombia to Andrei. Latin American countries are changing their migration policies. Actually, we at this moment have a contract with OIM, the International Organization for Migrants, to design and to implement for the first time the National Roundtable for Migrants here in Colombia. We will have first pilot sessions in the end of November and then in December. So even here in Colombia, which traditionally I would say was not interested in migrants because of the same reason that you mentioned. I mean, Colombia doesn't have problems with the growth of population. Even though potential, of course, we will face the same issue, like you mentioned, for China, which for many is surprising. I mean, China, the biggest, or one of the biggest, one of the two biggest countries in the world, and has these troubles how to sustain the older generation because the younger generation is not generating enough income. But Colombia was sort of close. It was difficult to immigrate to Colombia recently, change its policy, but Colombia is not the only one. I mean, we see Ecuador, we see Central American countries, we see, of course, Argentina has been very famous for having, for a long time, developed a policy that would provide some incentives for the migrants to travel there. Chile now, even Chile now is actually opening up for the migrants. In that respect, what are the challenges and opportunities for the countries that are wishing to actually benefit themselves from the opening up for migration? What are the plus and minuses?
Well, you guys probably in your courses discuss globalization and WTO as an expression of globalization. Globalization led to the formation of this new structure on the basis of GATT that includes GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs in Trade, GATT's General Agreement on Tariffs in Services, and TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property Issues. And WTO claims that it covers every aspect of the international market. It does not, because it doesn't cover the fourth component of international market, that is the international labor market. And it's clear why. The receiving countries, the global north, don't want to take upon themselves any obligations in this field. Meanwhile, 15 times more, for example, innovators come to the US than leave that country. So the question is, do we have an adequate legal infrastructure internationally and nationally? We don't. And we will probably not have, because of the role the global north countries play. I think the answer is related to what I started with at the very beginning. We are facing not one, but two very separate, very different migration flows, and there will be increasing stimuli for elites to move, and there will be increasing, growing fences for people who not belong to those groups to move. It's like in Europe that absolutely openly has two immigration regimes. Quarters Europe that makes it very hard to enter the EU legal space and physical space, and Europe without borders within. So as soon as you get in, you can move and you can get employment. but it would be harder and harder to move in. The good news is that countries like China are also entering this market and this competition, and it will kind of increase their potential. Some countries are not mentioned, but they are important in this regard. For example, Brazil. Brazil has become a country that imports, first of all, elite labor, but not only it, from other regions, including, ironically, Portugal. But in general, we'll see the increasing differentiation of policies towards migrants, not only labor markets, migrants worldwide.
So basically, you, if I understood you correctly, one of the greatest challenges has to do with this inequality in the flows of refugees, refugees not, but migrants, because you have people with a lot of money who comes and actually buy property or may invest a lot of money. You mentioned in the United States, in some areas, the golden number is $1 million US, and then you automatically got a green card. Or on some other areas, maybe as low as 300,000.
And some of the countries that are very actively selling their green cards and passports are small European states like Liechtenstein and Andorra and Monaco, Cyprus, Malta. But new countries are entering. Lots of Caribbean countries are doing that, and very, very actively. Same way, if you look at the major maritime countries that have the largest trading fleets in the world, this includes Aruba and Panama and Cyprus. So they have very low taxes, very simple regulation, and it's all done to bring in investment. And for many states, it works. But the recent trend, for example, the confiscations of property of the Russian new rich, the oligarchs, sends also kind of unpleasant signals. Right now, there's a huge outflow of money from London to countries like the United Arab Emirates, because it's not only Russians, it's the Arab sheikhs and the Chinese, the Indian billionaires who think, okay, it's Russians today, it might be us tomorrow. So respectively, there emerged new money flows that you wouldn't have expected yet, say, 2-3 years ago. And of course, there are countries that try to capitalize on that.
And of course, there is also a trend, for example, from the United States here in Latin America. We know Costa Rica and some other countries are trying to invite people who are retiring in the United States to come to live. I think in Costa Rica, it's more than a half population that actually is present in Costa Rica, who are retired people from the States who benefit from the lower prices. And as we know well, the exchange rate that may be favoring them. Yeah, but the weather as well. Yes, the weather as well. I prepared to receive your questions and please. But you need to use the mic, I guess.
First, I want to say that I love it. You say we in Colombia, as you already are very Colombian. You've been speaking about salary and workforce, but there is another issue about migration that has to do with culture and language and tradition that is not so clear in these economic policies about how people move, and when they move to a new country, they bring their background, they bring their traditions, and this also it also plays a role in adapting, staying. The French people have had issues with, women wearing their burqas, how do you call it? And it's been an issue, a security issue. No, because you need to have your face uncovered. And then they were saying, no, but this is our tradition. Yes, but you're not in your country, you're in ours. So it's a whole issue that is not really in the documents, is it? Or how?
No, in case of France, it's in the documents. They adopted a series of laws. One of them was thinly veiled, but it claimed that it's a general struggle against religious symbols in state institutions. So you have to remove the cross from public offices. But in reality, of course, it was directed against Muslims specifically, about the Muslim influence. It's everywhere. It's rampant. Again, it's what Trump played on. But the case, say, of the US is kind of comical. Huntington, are you familiar with Huntington? Anybody read him or dealt with him? No, Samuel Huntington. He wrote 3 books within a 20-year span. In the first one, he said, well, everybody is following right now the path towards market democracy. Look, first there were Protestant states that accepted competition in religious sphere. Therefore, well, they would accept competition in the economic sphere first. Then there would be Confucian, well, Judaic states and cultures. They would accept it too. It's harder for Confucians because of the hierarchy in society, but they would accept it. Now it's coming a time, he wrote in the 1980s, of Catholic countries. Very hard because Catholic Church is hierarchical, but they are accepting them now step by step. And then others would follow. And then 10 years later, he published a second book that he called The Clash of Civilizations. And in it he said, no, I was wrong. Ideology is dead because communism is defeated. But instead of ideology, there would come a religious well, factor, and the world would fall apart into roughly 10 civilizations based on religion. Say 3 Christian, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, 2 Muslim, Sunni, and Shia, and so on. And that would be a much bloodier conflict because you accept ideology as a conscious act. You accept religion unconsciously in your early childhood. So the 21st century would be a century of bloody conflicts among civilizations. And he was criticized, and people said, look, well, there are multi-ethnic states like the US, and they are peaceful and multi-civilizational. And we know that there's a pretty strong correlation between religion and region and ethnicity and race. And 10 years later, he published a third book, Who We Are. And in it, he said, oh, my opponents were right, but right in a perverse way. Conflict would come to the multi-ethnic countries and first of all to the US, because the US is facing a massive land-based, consistent Hispanic migration. So Spanish speakers, Catholics coming from one region, Latin America. And he said, if we don't stop it, well, we are doomed, because modern technology allows people not to change their identity. They continue speaking their languages. They continue to communicate with their families, because now it's not only cheap, it's free. You turn on Skype, you use cell phone, and so on. And again, it has led to a tremendous backlash. And unfortunately, after that, he died. So we don't know what would he have said next time. But, this became highly controversial. And in the US, say, in my classes, one of the issues students fight about, there are 3 definitions of American society. First, melting pot. Anybody is welcome, but everybody accepts new identity, and say second-generation migrants become Americans. Second, salad bowl. People come, but even second generation says, I am Chinese American, I am Colombian American, and so on. So they have dual identity. And Huntington said, no, we are becoming a mosaic society. People remain Chinese living in America, mosaic, yeah. Chinese Americans in the 3rd generation, Mexican Americans, and so on. Statistics doesn't prove it. The ratio of assimilation, acceptance of new identity, for new migrants is the same as for, say, migrants 100 years ago. So people keep getting assimilated, and it includes this giant Spanish-speaking community, 62 million people. But the fear among the whites is pretty strong. They don't usually express it because of political culture in the US, but they vote. And Trump was an expression of this fear, of this trend. So we'll see what happens in, what, 2 weeks now? Yeah, 2 weeks. Yeah, it's an issue that is very important in the US, but because of kind of political climate, it does not get spelled out much, but it's always present.
Only the US.
Yeah, sure.
We have
Anyway, sure.
migration and different cultures. People in the US move there and they don't learn the language. If you live in Miami,
Oh,
what do you think?
Miami is really a special case, but otherwise, you know, I got lost once in Miami 30 years ago and found myself in a Cuban area. And the only way I could get directions, there were no GPS systems at that time, was in Russian, because Cubans did not want to speak English, but they were okay with speaking Russian. It is also changing. This process goes, but yeah, Miami, with more than a half of the population being Cuban specifically, and huge other groups, including now Venezuelans, there are many groups there. In general, for the US, the largest group are Mexicans, second Puerto Ricans, third, well, they are Americans, but they still kind of take themselves separately very frequently. Very large group is from El Salvador. And in general, 8 groups account for something like 80% of Hispanic population in the US. Many are kind of settled in particular areas, like Miami is, of course, first of all, the hub for Cubans.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Hola. Hola, hola. Ah, sí. Ah, ok. Bueno, mi pregunta la voy a hacer en español porque me da miedo embarrarla en inglés. Okay, I'm going to try. There is a news that came out yesterday that said that Colombia and US are going to discuss about the possible elimination of the visa, but just for the common nationals people. So I don't know if what is a connational, and yeah, I don't know if it's true or it's false, but a newspaper here, El Tiempo, was the publisher of that news.
Well, look, I didn't fully catch it.
I think you're referring to some of the news that our current president, Gustavo Petro, after the announcement that the United Kingdom abolished visas for Colombian nationals, they did it also for some other nationals, Peruvians and some others, that he would pursue a policy that the United States would abolish visas, B1, B2 visas for Colombian nationals as well. The United States, as far as I know, did not pronounce, and your question is when it will happen or what? Okay.
Yeah, what happened? Because the discussion was supposed, the news was yesterday. 21st.
Just to remind you, it is not the first time when this question arises. If perhaps you know that the only nationals in Latin America who can enter the United States without a visa are Chileans. But Chileans were not the first one. The first one back 25, 30 years or even more were Argentinians. were able to enter the United States without a visa. And the visa waiver program, I'm actually not sure since when the US has adopted the visa waiver system to B1, B2. And as far as I understand, of course, Andrei, I will give you now a possibility to answer this question. As far as I know, for the United States, the moment when they start considering including one or another country into the visa waiver program is when the denial for the regular visa is less than 3%. I'm not sure, and unfortunately, I'm almost 100% positive that Colombia does not comply with the number. There are more denials than 3%.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do not know the situation in detail. I already mentioned to you that Colombia has the highest share of people with university education among migrants from Latin America. Roughly a third of Colombians coming to the US have university diplomas. So if such issues are going to be considered, Colombia will definitely be one of the first countries to receive it. But the irony is that immigration is not a priority of the Biden administration. He promised a lot, and he has not done much. In general, migration is very weird, I would say, area. Why Obama, who was a Democratic president, has deported more people from the US, more migrants, than Bush and Clinton taken together in their 16 years. The most liberal reform in migration sphere was introduced by Ronald Reagan, the most conservative president. And his logic was interesting. He was the one who introduced immigration amnesty. An amnesty, if a politician in the US right now says, I am for amnesty, it's basically a kiss of death. Reagan openly said, well, we will have immigration amnesty. At that time, there were 6 million illegals in the US. He amnestied 2.7 million, so about 45%. And his logic was very simple. He was before a governor of California, so the most state with the most migrants, and he was close to business. He said, I want people to be out of gray zone. It's always safer to have people within the legal field. The second president who tried to introduce a radical immigration reform was George Bush Jr. He was not able to, even while controlling the Congress, he could not get support of his own party. Obama's policies were very controversial. On the one hand, again, he was the deportation president. On the other hand, he introduced DACA, the deferred action for childhood arrivals. He tried to legalize 700 undocumented migrants, having very interesting logic. He said, I understand that there are people who oppose the amnesty on moral and legal grounds. You cannot offer amnesty to people who violated the law. But look, we have a huge number of people who were brought to the US as kids before they were 12 by their undocumented migrant parents. You cannot blame people for something that happened to them while they were children because, well, they were not responsible for that. So let's offer amnesty to people who are between 18 and 31, who don't have serious criminal record, who have education, who work or serve in the military. So let's give them temporary green cards. And he amnestied this way about 700,000 people who were technically the undocumented migrants, but were brought as children. Then Trump came and said, no, I will not recognize it. I will kill this program. And then Biden came in and said, no, I will immediately return to Obama's policies. And at least for now, not much has happened. It's a really strange period in regard to migration. But migration, first, it becomes a hot topic. It was not in the previous 50 years. Migration is one of the topics that deeply divides society. Because, for example, Trump talked about illegal migration, but his supporters understood very well that he talked about migration in general. When he talked about migration in general, his supporters understood very well that he talked about the racial composition of the US population. So it was read in between the lines. And therefore, introducing any kind of radical changes in migration sphere is very dangerous for a politician right now. It might cost him, her, a lot of votes.
Thank you.
And when yeah, no? When you say that migration is involuntary and involuntary, when you say that migration is voluntary and involuntary, you are for movement or for displacement, or when we have a bad environment or a bad government that is voluntary. Yeah.
Well, mostly the government, but not necessarily. And here comes a problem. Sorry. The refugee is defined very strictly by the international law. So remember, it's a person who has left his, her country of citizenship, the law says, nationality, due to a threat to one's life or the credible perception of a threat. And the threat should be based on such issues as, well, religion, race, ethnicity, national origin, belonging to a particular social group, or political beliefs. But now, if you look at the situation, there are tens of millions of people who technically are not refugees based on this definition, but they are forced to move. For example, climate refugees, people who have left because they cannot live where they used to live. Either temperature is so high that agriculture is impossible, or your region is totally flooded, or economic refugees, you simply cannot sustain yourself, or well, environmental refugees, you do not have access to fresh water or to adequate food. Or, for example, right now, even new types of people who are called, at least by the media, refugees, educational refugees. You cannot get access to normal education. And there was a case in New Zealand that was kind of both funny and scary. The whole population of one of the Pacific Rim Islands has appealed for an asylum in New Zealand on the ground that, according to the forecast, within the next 50 years, their country would go under the ocean, the whole country. And initially, the New Zealand government said, no, 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 this is not a basis for, claiming a refugee status. You are not threatened by government. There's nothing political there. Who cares that you would drown? And they appealed this case at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, of course, they should be treated as refugees, even though they are not defined as such. So the existing legal basis, both national and international, does not fit the new situation in the world. And at the same time, there's absolutely no change that this status would change, because countries that are the major recipients of migrants and refugees in the world have no desire to put upon themselves new legal obligations. So we have entered a situation, a stage when there emerges a widening gray legal zone. There are people who are de facto refugees, but they are not defined as refugees by international law, and therefore they are not entitled to any support. It's not the only area, but that's the essence. The law does not deal with issues of right or wrong, good or bad, only whether it corresponds to a law or not. And this discrepancy between the real situation and the legal definitions will only widen in the foreseeable future.
I have a question. I want to know about the transition between a person become refugee to migrant, because both have different conceptions in terms of how they go in the country, like a normal migration or as a refugee.
Refugees are a part of the forced migrant flow, and the forced migrant flow is a part of the migrant flow. So the concept of refugees is, again, pretty narrowly defined. But refugees are, again, there are about 25 million refugees in the world, while the number of forced migrants of different kinds is about 100 million. So you have to file a legal claim to be defined as refugee. And here is another situation, referring to the previous question. How do you do it? There's a set of legal agreements that make it harder for people to claim a refugee status. For example, there exists a concept of the first state of arrival. Theoretically, based on international law, you have to claim refugee status, ask for asylum, in the first country you encounter before, after you leave your own country. So, for example, if you left Guatemala, you have to claim refugee status in Mexico, not in the United States. And in the EU, it's a very interesting situation in this regard. First, countries that want to join the Schengen zone have to guarantee that they would eliminate all migration agreements with countries they neighbor on that are not EU members. So they would not offer some status that would have to be honored by the other Schengen zone countries. And it's a tremendous legal obstacle, because very frequently people who leave their countries find themselves in countries that are not much better. Say you leave Iraq and go to Syria, and surprise, it's not that great. Or well, you leave Iran and go to Iraq, and so on and so forth. So that's another problem right now internationally. If you have ever flown to the US or Europe, you know that airline representatives are very carefully checking on your passports, because they know that if something is wrong and they suspect that you would try to claim refugee status the moment you step, for example, on American soil, and something goes wrong, they will be kicked out, and you will be forced to take them back, you, the airline, without already even having a ticket. And that's a very serious issue in this regard. Why there is such a huge discrepancy? Because there are lots of people who have not received legal refugee status, or they don't fall under this situation. Here's an example for you from real life. Well, there was a case in the US about 20 years ago. A woman from West Africa comes to the US and he says, I'm asking for an asylum for protection because in my country, I am facing a prospect of female circumcision. And the court said, and we don't care. Well, you are not covered by any refugee provision. And they put her to jail where she spent a pretty long time because it was not even clear what to do with her. Then some human rights organizations hired an immigration lawyer and basically they got her out. But the question is, okay, the status has changed. What if 20 million women come and say, we are facing forced circumcision? Would they be given status? So especially in the US and in general in democracies, courts are extremely careful not to create precedent, especially, of course, in common law countries, that would lead to the huge expansion of the number of refugees coming on this particular basis. The same could be said, by the way, about this elimination of visas for a specific Latin American country. Others would immediately say, and what about us? And the US that operates on the basis of common law is, again, very careful in regard to the potential for creating any kind of precedent. It's always much easier to deal with authoritarian states. Whatever, you want, you get. You know, I'll tell you one story about the effectiveness of political systems. During the Yalta meeting of the Grand Coalition in 1945, Stalin meets with Roosevelt and with Churchill. Everybody is happy because it's January 1945. They know that they have won the war. It's a matter of time. And Stalin all the time offers some ideas. He said, well, what if we sign this agreement? And Roosevelt would listen to him and say, this is a great idea, Mr. Premier, but I'm afraid American public opinion would not support you, support me. And Stalin would look at him with pain and say, you know what, I think now that Soviet public opinion would not support me either. Let's shelve him. Then Stalin has another idea. And again, FDR would look at him and say, you know, it's great, Generalissimo, but I'm afraid the US Senate would not ratify this treaty. And Stalin would look at him strangely and say, yeah, you know, I think now the Supreme Soviet, the Soviet parliament would not ratify this treaty either. Then they have a break. Stalin goes with Molotov, his foreign minister, and Berezhkov, his interpreter, to a restroom. And Stalin is absolutely furious. And he says to Molotov, Vyacheslav, this Roosevelt guy, he thinks I'm a total idiot. He means he cannot pick up 2-3 senators, shoot them, and have others vote for anything he wants. So you can have different perceptions of democratic process. Yes, please.
So if I have an asylum in another country,
Bien cerca, sí.
if I have an asylum in another country, I know, if I'm not wrong, that you have to spend some years before you can come back to your country. Is that right?
¿Así? Pero
Yeah.
no, o sea, no se escucha nada.
Yes, the refugee status is always given for a particular period of time, say 1, 3, 5 years. And
Country before those you have-
yeah, you have to be recertified. And if the situation in your country has improved, you can be denied an extension. Besides that, there might be a requirement that, say, if you stay for 3 years, for example, you either have to move to a different status or you have to leave. If you get a refugee status, then the question is, have you changed your legal position within a particular period of time? If if you have this status, you technically can travel. Refugee status is regulated by this International Refugee Convention that says that you're entitled to a lot of privileges. You would get support from the receiving state. You would be allowed to study or work. So you have significant privileges compared to a conventional migrant. And usually you can travel. The country, the receiving state would issue you travel document for this period of time. The whole concept started to develop after World War I, when there was a huge flow of refugees, first of all, from Russia, from the communist Russia, but also from the former German and Austro-Hungarian empires. And a Norwegian explorer, Fridtjof Nansen, has suggested to the League of Nations to issue the so-called Nansen passports, passports of non-citizens who have no affiliation with any country that they can address for protection. And then the idea evolved, and after World War II, created was a concept of refugee, and the Refugee Convention was adopted in 1948. That's how it evolved.
Hi. Hola. Hola. Mr. Korovkov, you were talking about types of migration, the international and the internal. At the internal position and taking into account that migration divided society, do you consider Colombia a divided country affected by migration? And does this create stereotypes in the internal policy? Thank you.
Well, in case of Colombia, it's mostly internal migration, I would guess, yeah? These huge internal flows of politically motivated migrants. What's...
I said that do you consider Colombia a divided country affected by migration? And is that like affection create stereotypes in internal policy?
I don't know if you can answer this question because it's in Colombia. You might refer, or you're likely to refer to the Venezuelan crisis, and because the Venezuelan migration created divisions in Colombia. That's the question.
Yeah, I am not familiar with the situation, but it is my understanding that you had a significant number of internally displaced persons because of the internal conflict, and now Venezuelans coming. And that means that Colombia is changing its position in the world migration chain that we talked about. Colombia became a country, it was a country that was sending migrants abroad. Now it receives migrants, and it also serves as a, well, transit country, because some of these people come but try to go later to the US or other countries. And this sharp change always leads, yes, to internal divisions. It is really so. So at least there is some potential for the internal tension, if not conflict, then tension. Whenever large numbers of not simply migrants, but displaced people show up, of course, it creates pressure on welfare system, on labor market. It creates other tensions. It's It's inevitable. Yet in the long run, countries that receive migrants for the most part gain tremendously because they get labor, they get demographic support that maybe Colombia doesn't need yet, in contrast to many, and they get some elite migrants. And what does it mean, elite migrants? You don't spend money on their preparation, but then you get ready-made material. So say the West, it brings in huge numbers of elite migrants that it didn't spend money on their education, on their preparation. And it's always a huge advantage in the long run. But of course, the way the media works, the way politicians act, they always emphasize the negative aspects. And it works for them.
Thank you.
Say in the US, just an example for you, more than 50% of dissertations, PhDs, defended in American universities in basic sciences are those made by foreigners in such areas as nuclear physics, chemical engineering. It's about 80% right now. So Americans import brains on a tremendous scale. And that means you don't, again, spend money, you rely on foreign schools that you did not invest in, and you capitalize on that. Plus, if you bring in people to study at your universities, most of these people still have to pay for their education, high rates. And this is a huge monetary inflow too. That's why many countries deliberately develop their education systems oriented towards the international students. We mentioned Australia, we mentioned United Arab Emirates. Some countries on this list are quite surprising.
Yeah, I have a question. Well, lately Puerto Rico has been kind of silent about the issues that they've had with the federal government, because some people in Puerto Rico wanted to be like a state and some others wanted it to be a free country because their status is not well defined neither for Puerto Ricans nor Americans. And I think that the United States seems to be a little bit, how can I say it? Like, they haven't given Puerto Rico like much attention. And now I'm not really sure what's happening over there with the situation, whether they would want to leave their current status and become a country, a free country, or become a state. What do you think that will happen?
Well, it's not even Puerto Rico itself. It's the Democrats who want it because they think it's guaranteed 2 seats in the Senate. The same concerns Washington, D.C. Democrats also want to make it a state, and it's guaranteed 2 Senate seats for them. Adding new states required a change in the Constitution. The way American system built, the Constitution is a kind of sacred cow. It's incredibly hard to change even a line in the Constitution. And because parties essentially balance each other out in US Congress, and because of a tremendous polarization of American political life, at present, there is no change. There is no chance this constitutional change would be made. But what's interesting at present already, there are 5 states in the District of Columbia where minorities represent a majority even now. So in Hawaii, about 80% of the population are minorities. In California, New Mexico, and a number of other states, whites are less than 50% of the population. So it's a trend that will lead to the change in voting attitudes by itself. What happens, look at the situation. There are 62 million Hispanics in the US. More than a half of children being born in the US right now are Hispanic. So a generation later, whites will be still a majority of old people, but the majority of younger generations would be minorities. So there would be this dual divide within the society. But what is ironic about it, Hispanics, and it goes back to Huntington, a kind of rejects his major concept. Hispanics are expected by political analysts to be more on the left and more support the Democratic Party more. In reality, the trend is such that Hispanics increasingly become more politically conservative and Republican. There are different reasons for that. One of them are social issues, that they perceive them very differently. There was a trend towards the constant increase in the share of Hispanics voting for Republicans. George Bush Jr. got 42% of Hispanic vote. It was expected that if his younger brother, Jeb, became the Republican candidate, he would have been the first one to get more than 50% of Hispanic vote. Jeb speaks fluent Spanish, his wife is Mexican, but he was defeated by Trump. And the share of Hispanics went down to 27%. Yet, right now, the expectation is that this trend would come back. And Hispanics, while their share in the population is quickly growing, they become increasingly Republican. So there would be at least a balance between Republicans and Democrats within that population group. So even though the issue of Puerto Rico and DC as states is right now deadlocked, well, the general trend are such that the number of states where minorities would become a majority is highly visible, and it also would influence the electoral results. The problem of American system is that in reality, in presidential elections, you know, voting are not people, voting are states. So states, 48 out of 50 states vote on the basis of who gets the majority within a state. And the result is that the election is decided by the election in 10 to 12 states. Others are not in the game at all. We can say now that Tennessee, for example, would be Republican. Massachusetts would be Democratic. So everything is decided in states that are more or less balanced, 10 to 12 states. Others are not in play at all.
Well,
No, как странно.
Hello, thank you. I got a question is concerned to this maybe a hypothetical case, maybe. Taking on account when the first 100 days of this government has been, we can expect, I can say, maybe a portion of the country will try to migrate to the United States looking for more stability or looking for a vision of society that's more in line with what they think. I'm talking about more conservative people from this country, Colombia. They might try to migrate to United States. And I think there's also a lot of migration going from South America to North America, as you said. How do you think the United States may want to respond to this and it's difference between the different parties, because it has been said it's not that Democrats want to bring Latin people because they're going to resonate, as you said, with their speech, with their politics, and so they can gain voters. Because right now it's like an internal fight in the United States for the rights of voting, right? We've seen that since the last election, that the Republicans had a lot of issues with mail-in vote and things like that.
So you refer to some expectations.
Yeah, how do you think the United States can see challenges?
But you refer because of the left government.
Что усиление миграции отсюда.
As far as I understand your question, because here in Latin America, most of the governments now are in the hands of the left-wing parties, and more likely in Brazil we will have once again the left-wing government. So this will increase the trend of conservative right-wing people who would willing to migrate to the United States because of that. So it will increase the base potentially, most likely for the Republican Party.
Yes.
It might, because say Venezuelans come in and they're really angry and they really vote very right wing. Venezuelans who get citizenship start to vote Republican right now. It's visible. Say in Miami area, there's a lot of angry people right now. But the U.S. Desperately needs migrants in reality. That's the irony of it. There is a huge backlash against immigration, but the U.S. is entering a demographic crisis that I talked about. American population for a very long time grew by 3 million. 2 million out of this were demographic factors, so the newborn minus those who died, and 1 million were migrants. Then this growth declined to 2 million in 2010s. Then between 2017 and 2020, US population grew just by 1 million. Last year, US population grew by 394,000. It's a 8-fold decline compared to 20 years ago. So the US does not get enough people to provide for an effective economic growth. So America desperately needs migrants, while the government, well, especially under Trump and under the pandemic, was slowing down this process. And there emerged a backlash against immigration. That's the irony of the situation. And the root cause of Trump's success was, I already mentioned it to you, that when he talked about illegal immigration, his base understood him that he talked about all immigration. He was saying, I am against illegal immigration, but I want immigration. His base was saying, no, this guy knows what he says. When he was talking about immigration, he was talking about race. He was addressing the white majority, telling them, I'll protect your status and your share in the population. There was a table here. And that's, again, ironic, because American economy, American demographic situation requires large numbers of migrants. Where would they be coming from? Contrary to the general perception, the largest group of migrants comes right now to the US from Asia, not from Mexico or even Latin America. Countries like India, China, the Philippines, Vietnam. But of course, the most visible is still migration from Latin America. And again, migration patterns are changing, and Hispanics for a very long time were viewed as the potential voting bloc for Democrats. It's not so anymore, and vice versa. Cubans always were way to the right of the others. Yet now other groups arrive, especially Venezuelans, who are also way to the right. So there are internal divisions within this community too.
My question is regarding.
Yeah.
My my question is regarding in fact United States needs more migration, but is how they are thinking about the people that are already there, that is illegal, and but in fact they don't have a formal job. I know that if you are illegal, you still have to pay taxes, but you don't have a formal job like a real one. So my question is, okay, they have to thinking about the new migrants, but the one that they are really right now there is another issue or something like it's just a problem that they have to address. I have a question about that.
Yeah, there is a constant divide among migration experts, not only among politicians in this regard. The usual claim is migrants, illegal migrants, they take advantage of the system because they get some social support, but they don't pay taxes. In reality, the way American system is organized, everybody pays taxes simply because, well, you have sales tax that roughly is 10% on average. You have other taxes. Every time you buy gas, you pay, well, huge tax and so on. So the opposite opinion is that vice versa. The undocumented migrants pay much more than they receive in exchange, because in the US, everything is market, say healthcare system, well, to some extent education, so that migrants overpay. The overall amount generated in terms of GDP by undocumented migrants alone is about $2 trillion a year in the $20 trillion economy. So at least 10% are generated by undocumented migrants who are underpaid and who do not legally even exist. So in reality, I am closer to this opinion that the undocumented migrants are constantly underpaid, ripped off, because they pay a significant share of taxes without getting even the conventional social services. But yes, there are always some attempts to, well, rip them off. For example, in California, right now, the most liberal state, but in 1996, they had a referendum on Proposition 178. They wanted to deny children of undocumented migrants right to use public schools and attend to any social services. It failed. Well, it was supported by the electorate, but it got stuck in the courts. But such attempts are made right now very frequently on state level. So states are introducing laws cutting off the undocumented migrants from social services. And the number is also controversial. Right now, probably the correct estimate would be 10.5 million of undocumented migrants. The irony of the situation is that according to Amendment 14 of the US Constitution, any child born in the US, regardless of the parent status, becomes American citizens. So in reality, there are close to 6 million children who are US citizens living in the families of undocumented migrants. So if you imagine hypothetically the situation when government decides to deport the undocumented migrants, they would have to deport 6 million American citizens. So in reality, there are many legal obstacles to things that politicians promise. But in general, of course, in American system, when healthcare is ridiculously expensive, when university education is ridiculously expensive. When many social services that are considered to be conventional in other countries are market-based in the US, well, if you do not have legal status, you are, well, in serious problem economically. It's very tough.
I'm afraid we have to finish with this part. And thank you so much, Andrei, for this global view of the international migration in the United States. Thank you.